join this? Said she.
Okay, so welcome to this meeting. Our guest tonight, Agata Łuksza, is an assistant professor in the Institute of Polish Culture, University of Warsaw. She's the author of Glamour, Femininity, Performance, Actress as an Object of Desire, which was published in Warsaw University Press Theatre Institute in 2016, as well as of numerous articles in Polish and international journals, such as Contemporary Theatre Review, Feminist Media Studies, Journal of Fandom Studies, and Theatre Journal. Her research interests include the history of 19th and early 20th century, gender, 20th century theater, of course, gender, body and sexuality, colonial and postcolonial histories, and also Gothic studies and fun studies. She received a team award from the Polish Association for Theatre Research for a series of volumes depicting women's theatre history in Poland. She is a board member of the European Association for the Study of Theatre and Performance and the co-editor of his journal, European Journal of Theatre and Performance. This conversation is organized, has the title Polish Theatre History Seen from a Feminine Point of View, and it's organized by Janowicz Center for Screen and Performing Arts Studies at Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj. I'm going to moderate it with my colleague Miruna Roncan. But first, before asking questions, and we have many questions for Agata because we are working ourselves on a similar project, which is called the Multimedia Dictionary of Romanian Theatre. But we were not so bold until now to just investigate the female theater creators in Romania. So we want to hear more about their approach, and we are really interested in discovering methods of research and the results and the working process, of course. So welcome again, and please share with us what you can about Hypatia.
Thank you, Christina, for this generous introduction. I will start by sharing my screen. Just a sec. Hopefully you can see it. I'm going to talk to you about a team research project. I want to stress it very strongly in the beginning. It's not mine project. It's a project that really a lot of amazing people have been working on for more than a decade. Mostly women at different stages of their academic career. So when I was starting to work on Hypatia project, I was actually a PhD candidate. That's really a long time ago. So this project has been entirely devoted to women's theatre practice in 20th century Poland. And the premise of this project was to collect and investigate different traces of women's creative presence in theatre other than acting. So we do not exclude actresses from the project, but they are not in the center of it. Rather, we aimed at settling whether the popular claim that women's discursive absence in theatre history relies on their real absence in theatre institutions had any backup in historical evidence. So I'm sure you're familiar with this argument. We don't write about female directors in the past because there were not any female directors in the past, etc. So we wanted to check it with the historical records, whether in fact women were absent from theatre institutions and whether they did not write plays, did not direct plays, they did not manage any theatres, etc. And I can give you a spoiler at the very beginning. No, this turned out to be not true, of course. So as a result of this inquiry, we launched a web page which not only documents the project, but also hosts diverse resources. There are more than 200 digitalized dramas that you can access from this webpage. Some of them were never in print. There's a selection of women's texts on theater. There's also a 1,200 page chronicle containing records of theater events involving female artists in 20th century, and an index of names of authors, directors, stage designers working in Polish theater between 1944 and 2014. There are also video conversations with theater women. So we did not only search for archives, we also created sources by ourselves by recovering memories of women that were never asked to talk about their work in theater. This first edition of Hypatia, it started in 2012 and lasted until 2016, but these are only years of official funding. It does not mean that we stopped in 2016. We continue to work in between the two editions of the project. I will speak about the second edition in a moment, but just to sum up the results of the first edition, I mean the material results of first edition. So apart from the web page, we also published 3 books. And when Christina mentioned that I got a team award with other people from the Hypatia team, this award was granted to us for those 3 volumes that we published when the project finished. So the first volume was an anthology of women's 20th century drama with the title Of Female Gender. I had the pleasure to co-edit this particular volume with my colleague Agata Łuksza, and we divided the dramas into 5 thematic blocks. Each was preceded by a foreword written by a different scholar. So it was very important for us to give voice to as many team members as possible, because we sort of believed in this plurality also within our own work. And these thematic blocks sort of resembled or reflected in our view the specificity of the female drama that we read, and we read like hundreds and hundreds of those dramas. It turned out there are many of them. And these keywords for us were emancipation, revolution, silence, Shoah, and revisions. The second volume, titled The Unconsciousness or Consciousness of Theater, is a collection of more than 30 women's texts on theater, and I will speak briefly about women's texts on theater later. Just a few words of explanation of the title. There is a very well-known anthology of texts on theater in Poland called The Consciousness of Theater. And in this book, The Consciousness of Theater, texts written by women constitute less than 5% of all texts. So that's why we sort of directly got into a direct discussion with this book by giving to our book a title, The Unconsciousness of Theater, by showing how the female line of thinking about theater was never voiced in public discourse on theater and in books on the history of theater of 20th century in Poland. And the third volume, Agora, contains statistics concerning theater institutions, and this is the most depressing book ever. Like, these statistics are really just simply depressing. I will also talk about them in a moment. And this was the most tedious work. It it demanded from us to sit down in the libraries and just go page by theater records and writing down every single play directed by a woman, every single award given to a woman, every single text written by a woman. And then we were able to create graphics and statistics, etc., which showed how much women's presence was marginalized and how much women were discriminated in Polish theater. And at this stage, meaning the first edition of Hypatia, our principal investigator was Joanna Krakowska. And now we are working on the second edition of Hypatia, but as I said, between 2016 and 2022, we also did a lot of work. It's not that we took such a long break. Especially me and Kasia, we worked on formulating the theories, the theoretical frames for our research. We tried to understand the results, yes, the statistics, and everything we found in the archives. Kasia, me, and Katarzyna Kułakowska, who is not the principal investigator, so it's just we are also very close friends. And in the second edition, basically we want to continue what we did in the first edition, because we are far from, being over. I mean, there's still so much to read and discover in the archives. This time we want to publish 4 books, 2 anthologies of drama and 2 collections of women's texts on theater, but now they will be a bit more specific. So one of the anthology will contain drama for adults, but the other will contain drama for children, because it turned out that women were particularly active in this field. They wrote like many texts, especially for children, which is also one of the reasons why they are forgotten and not present in historical books, because obviously, as drama for children has a much lower status than drama for adults. And as for the collections of women's texts on theater, one of the volume will consist of reviews and essays, so it will be a theater critique conducted by women in 20th century, but the second volume will be devoted entirely to theater pedagogy, which is also a very marginalized topic in Polish theater history. So our findings from the first edition demonstrate that throughout the 20th century, women very actively participated in theatrical field, assuming different roles necessary for play production. However, they were always in the minority. Women's representation in theater in other realms than acting does not match women's representation in society. And yet their presence in theater history is even less significant. So yes, theater is masculinized in terms of direction, playwright, etc. But when you look at theater history books, women's presence is even less well represented. So this shows that in order to study women's theatrical input, we need to pose questions not only about social and cultural mechanisms which hinder women's presence in theater institutions, but also about social and cultural mechanisms which eliminate this presence from theater history, which make us forget their names and works. So as our research documenting women's prolific and diversified activities in theater shows, women's discursive absence can no longer be put down to the alleged real absence. Rather, it results from the ways in which theater archives are created and explored. In order to retrieve and understand traces of women's presence left in supposedly objective archives, we must ask both what becomes part of the archives and what do we want to find in the archives while writing so-called conventional or hegemonic theater history. Which names, texts, performances become objects of positive selection, so they are cherished and remembered, and which become objects of negative selections, and thus forgotten, and in the end erased, and why? So when me and Kasia, when we started to look for theoretical explanations, we were very much moved by one of articles written by Paul Connerton, whom I'm sure you heard about, who is dealing with cultural memory and mechanism of memory and forgetting. And in one of his articles, he introduced various types of forgetting. And one of such type is repressive erasure, which of course appears most clearly in revolutionary and totalitarian regimes. However, Connerton argues that repressive erasure need not always take malign forms, meaning that it is not always about bringing down statues and removing names from the records, which also happens, but this is not the case. He claims that it can be, this repressive erasure can be encrypted covertly and without apparent violence, and yet still successfully support and replicate the master narrative. So while in the 20th century, women were not legally forbidden to write or stage dramatic texts, that is, that they not suffer from apparent violence, undoubtedly they experience more hidden forms of oppression. Likewise, while it was not legally forbidden to include their works in theater history, more encrypted mechanisms of repressive erasure guaranteed their almost utter obliteration. So, having gathered numerous accounts of women's theater practice, we analyzed them with the purpose of uncovering these encrypted mechanisms, to quote on Connerton, which for decades had so effectively sustained and fortified women-free historical discourse in Poland. For the clarity of our argument, we divided women's theatrical input into three fields: direction, theory, and drama, though it is worth remembering how tightly they remain interwoven. And within each of these fields, we identified principal governing rules, this encrypted mechanism, which undermine women's achievements and sentence them to oblivion. Those rules are status rule, manifesto rule, and drama war staging rule, respectively, for each field. And I will talk very briefly about these rules. Probably I will talk about the status rule for the longest time. Its most conspicuous manifestation, which policies memory and history of theater direction, is the modernist concept of a godlike director, understood as an authority figure, a singular source of power, invention, imagination, intellect. And traditionally, such a conceptualization implies male gender, simultaneously rendering actors female. So this modernist figure has posed a particular great challenge for women working as theater directors. For instance, a well-known director, Lydia Zamkow, whom you can see in the slide, recalled that in the beginning of her career, male actors used to ostentatiously read newspapers during rehearsals. So they were convinced that she, as being a woman, has nothing to tell them about acting. But it also cast a strong shadow on the memory of female directors, turning them into curiosities, freaks, for which by definition there is no place in the master narrative, unless in the footnotes. So now I'm moving to the statistics to show how the status rule works. The statistics demonstrate that women more often work in peripheral, either geographically or institutionally, and thus less prestigious theaters, while historical narrative privileges well-established institutions in central locations, such as Warsaw or Kraków in Polish case. So, for example, in random seasons of 78, 79, 88, 89, and 1999, and these are really randomly picked up seasons, all premieres at the main stages of Polish most prestigious theaters, the National Theatre in Warsaw and the Old Theatre in Krakow. Yes, we have two sort of national theaters, two institutions that have the status of the national theater, like low status of national theater, legal status, I should say. These are National Theatre in Warsaw and Old Theatre in Krakow. And these theaters have main stage, but also more smaller stages, sort of cameral stages. But as for the main stages, in these seasons that I mentioned, in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, none premiere was directed by a woman, none. They did direct plays in these theater institutions, but only in those more intimate sort of experimental spaces, but not on the main stage. On the other hand, theater history is silent about women's tremendous efforts to bring theater to small towns and their less educated audiences in the after-war period. In this case, status rule works against women by different valorization of theater space. So it's not only the figure of the director, it's also a valorization of theater space. To make matters worse, female directors tend to engage in puppet theater and children theater, which is also marginalized for the benefit of dramatic theater dominated by male artists. And here on the slide, you can see the same seasons, showing the percentage of plays directed by women in dramatic and puppet theaters respectively. So on average, it's between 9 and 12% as for dramatic theater and around 25% in puppet theater. So still it's not much, yes, it's like 25% of all puppet theater plays are directed by women, which means that 75% is directed by men, but it's still much more than 11% in case of dramatic theater. It also shows that women, when they do practice theater, they very often work in more marginalized fields like puppet theater. Quite honestly, it hasn't changed much. What is depressing about the statistics is, as you can see here, like 70s, 80s, 90s, nothing is happening, right? The numbers are permanent. It did change a little in 21st century, I should say. We have a big wave of very successful female directors. So when I checked the statistics last time in 2015, I know it's been a few years ago, but that's the last season I kind of counted down. 25% of premieres in dramatic theaters were done by female directors. So there was you might say a huge increase, but still it's not so much. And 20% of premieres were based on female texts, which is very few, quite honestly. And then again, one of Polish most successful female director, Weronika Szczawińska, who is around 40 years old and has been active for around 15 years and who identifies herself as a feminist. She actually claims that investing in a feminist perspective in Polish theater is really extremely difficult and exposes the director to ridicule, to mockery, and many ideological issues, including like not getting the job, not getting the direction, etc. Despite the fact that she might be seen as quite successful artist, she still thinks that the etiquette of a feminist director is very problematic in Polish context. So finally, to close up on the status rule, it's also important to notice that other ways of acquiring status within theater direction field, which have remained relatively inaccessible for women. So the master narrative, the historical master narrative, privileges acclaimed artists who gained awards, yes, who gained prestigious awards. And the problem is that women rarely sit in theatrical juries and other decisive bodies. So perhaps it should not come as a surprise that they rarely gain any awards. So on average, women have constituted 20% of jury members in various theater contests and festivals. And the annual Konrad Swinarski Award, established in 1976, which is the most desired prize for a theater director in Poland, was first granted to a woman as late as in 2017. So, yes, 40 years after being established. And also a theater director, to be visible, should campaign for their status by self-presentation, underlying their own artistic ideas, originality, and importance, preferably in the form of an artistic program or manifesto. And this actually brings us to the second field, theory, and to the manifesto rule. So the manifesto rule is bad news for women are working in theater, because it turns out that women just don't write manifestos. Apparently, it's not a form that they feel comfortable with. Manifestos are mostly written by men, and this is also a very specific form of writing or expressing one's artistic views, very much connected to the figure of the demiurge, yes, this artistic genius that I spoke earlier about when I was discussing the status rule. And from our findings, we came to conclusion that female metatheatrical reflection has different attributes. First of all, women in the history of the theater rarely spoke unasked. So consequently, they articulated their views mostly in conversations or when invited to comment on specific topics. So therefore, if you want to learn about what women think about theater, you need to read diaries, memories, letters, confessions, or interviews. Secondly, women artists tend to use their own practice as a starting point to propose any larger theories and not the other way around. So in most cases, it's like analyzing their own experience and perhaps, but not necessarily, coming up with a larger theory about theater stemming from their own experience. While manifesto is like the vision is first and then it's the practice. So in women's case, most often it's the other way around. This means that their opinions usually are a kind of testimony of their holistic experience. They are very often memories, not necessarily problematized in a way that would be satisfactory for a theater historian. So these texts are very often non-linear, without cause and effect relationship. They are also filled with emotions, which of course, again, excludes them from the hegemonic historical discourse. So a collection of women's texts on theater that we published was an attempt to illustrate this specificity of female presence and absence in metatheatrical discourse. These voices are varied. They are not subject to conventions of program statements. They grow out of personal experience. They are non-authoritative, unclosed, indefinitive. And coming to the third rule, the drama worth staging rule, it resembles the manifesto rule in many ways. It undermines women's achievements in the field of dramaturgy. This rule sentences female playwrights to oblivion because it values the texts meeting the criteria established in centuries-long process by male theater artists. If female playwrights undertake denigrated topics or experiment with forms of expression, thus reflecting and manifesting their gendered lived experience, then in androcentric culture, such artistic attempts are deemed to be marginalized. From the pool of more or less well-known female dramatic texts collected by our team and created between the end of the 19th century and the second half of the 20th century, we selected for publication a dozen. That choice was not easy. We didn't know which criteria should we choose. We didn't know how to choose this dozen texts in the very beginning. Initially, we discussed the artistic value of the dramas that we read, but then we started to think, what does it mean really, drama worth staging? And is it really relevant for our research? Isn't it really relevant for female dramas? Very few texts, in fact, met commonly accepted aesthetic and thematic criteria. So we decided to reevaluate the criteria, we decided to deconstruct this drama worth staging rule. And in the end, we decided that we will focus on these texts which resonate with us, which create discussion between us, which create emotions between us, which we feel need to discuss, even if judging from widely accepted aesthetic point of view, these texts are not good. And in this way, actually, we moved toward what is often called unconventional history. So unconventional history has different rules than conventional history. To put it very, very briefly, it's a huge topic, unconventional history, alternative histories, etc. But what distinguishes unconventional history is acceptance of emotionality, empathy, and honesty in a historical work. And we found out that sort of intuitively, these became our primary criteria when discussing which plays should be published in our anthology. So in opposition to dominant history, unconventional history refers to emotions, empathy, honesty, not only as methodological tools, but also these categories signal the location of the narrative's author. The author who often treats historical writing as an ideological battlefield against various forms of oppression. And our standpoint was never neutral. We never sort of hide that we think women were oppressed in theater and in theater history, and they were marginalized. And we want them to be more present. We want to recover their history. So yes, we did have an ideological agenda when we started this project. That's why it was called Feminist Research Project, which actually was very problematic in terms of getting funding, because we very much wanted to keep this phrase Feminist Research Project, but some people did not want to sign underneath it for fear of losing money. But anyway, that was our agenda. We wanted to do that. So our standpoint was clear, and we kind of make it known to everybody in our writings and our presentations. So In this way, unconventional history is also an intervention history. It's a form of criticism of culture which tries to change social awareness. It's also a way to restore the voice to those whose academic history has deprived of it. So beside empowering the female voice and at the same time revealing its distinctive features, Hypatia has been primarily an attempt to challenge the stability of existing artistic hierarchies and to call into question the current paradigms according to which artistic and social theatrical events are documented, described, and ordered. And by creating the counter-archive, Hypatia fights for justice in the field of memory, the way we see it. And I would like to conclude this presentation by clarifying the problematic issue of gender, which manifests itself whenever such research focused solely on people of one defined assigned sex is undertaken. In other words, why bother to retrieve the history of women's theater practice? So our understanding of gender, sex is not essentialist. We are past the second wave, even though it have never happened in Poland, but we are past it. We think that women's art is not interesting for us for the reason that it is created by people who are born women, because to paraphrase the classic, no one is born women, but rather becomes a woman. So what is fascinating about women's art is that it has been inevitably infiltrated and conditioned by the very experience of becoming a woman, and consequently by the modes of being in the world as a woman. Hence, if traces of women's theater practice are subjected to implicit mechanisms of repressive erasure, which force them out of the archives and dominating theater discourse, something more is forfeited than just random examples of theater art. Heterogeneity of life, epistemological and emotional difference, social, political, and artistic alternatives which could refashion our reality. Thank you so much. These are the...
Thank you, Agata. Yes. I think applauses are in order, even if they are virtual, for you and for the entire team that has worked for this project, because you mentioned that there is a team behind, and it's pretty obvious that not a single person can do such in-depth research. Yeah, there are so many questions I would ask right now, and I'm so excited that you mentioned the fact that you recognize from the beginning, or I don't know if from the beginning or in your conclusions, that you have an ideological agenda, which is something very bold. I don't imagine that there were enthusiastic responses to this declaration, which is kind of a manifesto, unlike the lack of manifestos that you mentioned. So I guess my first question, sorry Miruna for jumping like this, but I want to know, what was the reaction when you declared that that you have an ideological agenda, and this is what they will discover in the results of the project?
What was the reaction? There is just a bunch of female scholars that resembles a bunch of witches and trying to write new history of Polish theater. I think that was more or less in the beginning. But because we continued our work and we came up with results, and some of them are very hard results, hard in terms of difficult to undermine, like the statistics. I mean, in men's world, you can't really discuss with the statistics, so we provided them with statistics. And these statistics were really smashing. It's an entire volume of statistics, page after page, showing those mechanisms of discrimination and erasure. So in the end, we actually, as I mentioned, we're given an award by Polish Society for Theater Research, which is not, there are many progressive theater scholars in Poland, but many people are very attached to more conservative ways of writing history. And of course, it's their right. But what I want to say is that all in all, theater researchers in Poland are not unified in the progressive ways of doing research, particularly historical research. Yes, I think that theater histories in particular are very attached to more conservative models of doing history. Then, of course, we're living in this post-feminist times whenever you want to discuss women's discrimination, you hear that, oh, come on, we've discussed that already, we're over it, like, get over it, you know, find some new topics. So we actually kind of proved with this research that we're not over it. It's an ongoing process, and it's been changing very, very slowly. Yeah. So if I were to sum up, I think that in the beginning, like with many feminist projects, that was something like weird, bizarre, let them do it, who cares? And then the results of this project had to be reckoned with. And for progressive theater historians, Hypatia is a very important project, which resonates very strongly. And for conservative, well, they just, you know, don't change their point of view anyway. So what can we do? But I should say that one of the results that I think I forgot to mention, one of the results of or consequences of the project was that we sort of started to cooperate also with theater artists, of course, female theater artists, most of them feminist theater artists. And some of the plays that we kind of brought out from the archives were staged by them. So, or there was some performative readings of many plays. So we kind of cooperated also with the artists, and we are in touch all the time. So we are their historical theoretical background, and they actually take many of the plays or fundings of our research and put them onto the stage, which I think is really great.
I'm really fascinated about the project, your project, and also the fact that you managed to have 2 stages of large teams, which is something I was dreaming all my life. And because we were not funded or financed, we couldn't do that. But my first question is about the balance, the proportions between men critics and female critics in Polish theater. You know, I was abducted by a 7 years project related to theater criticism. And one of my late discoveries were about the fact that after the 60s, step by step, the criticism stage in Romania took by women, step by step. And the power of the women's theater analysis and even theory increased spectacularly around the 70s, like that. And I'm really interested about the proportion between men and women critics, and if possible, the differences of authority between men's voices and women's voices in theater criticism.
Thank you, Miruna. I'm afraid I will not be able to give you a really detailed answer to your question. Our work on theater critics has just started. We didn't pay much attention to theater critic in the previous edition. And now there is a team that works solely on theater critic. I keep working on drama, of course, but they created like a separate team within the team. And I think that in 2 or 3 years, they will have like very detailed results about those different aspects that you're asking. But from my, knowledge about Polish theater history, but without giving you proper numbers or statistics, because I don't have such, I can tell that generally it's been a man's voice. When I think about well-known female theater critics with really strong authority, there's only one name that pops up to my mind. Most of them were men, and I don't think we have had such a switch as you described in the 70s or 60s, 70s in the proportion between theater critics. I think it still stayed with mostly with men. But again, this can be not true. Meaning that there is a huge chance that there were many female theater critics, but they had less authority, and that's why I right now don't know about them.
Yeah.
This is very possible. So what I'm saying right now sort of reflects, let's say, mostly
general impression.
General knowledge about theater.
Okay.
It can be untrue.
Thank you.
It does have something to do with the status role, because more women writing about theater would have probably get more recognition for women directors, or maybe not necessarily, I don't know, because the internalized misogynism has functioned and it's still functioning all over. So maybe that wouldn't have been necessarily something happening. But my question would be, what would you say were the most powerful discoveries that you made during this project, maybe able to prompt a rewriting of the canon of Polish theater? Do you think that kind of rewriting would be possible by now, or it's still a lot of work to do?
The most powerful were, there were many discoveries on the way. As you know, Polish theater history is dominated by 2 names, Grotowski and Kantor. It's still very hard to discuss Polish theater history and not talk about Grotowski and Kantor. So they constitute the canon, the strongest canon, which is kind of interesting because it's not mainstream theater, yeah? So it's the avant-garde theater, but it constitutes the canon. The way I see it is, first of all, we were surprised by the numbers. there were so many different activities undertaken by women. And there were so many texts, dramatic texts written by women. Even now, even though we thought that we read a lot and discovered a lot in the first edition, now that we got back to the archives, and after 4 months, we have more than 1,000 new dramatic texts, and it's actually terrifying. I mean, who's going to read that? So the first thing is that, I mean, women really wrote a lot of dramatic texts, a lot of them. I personally worked a lot with one particular artist that was kind of famous in the interwar years in the 20th century, but then after Second World War never managed to regain recognition. And her name was Maria Morozowicz-Szczepkowska, and I read her works in her, you might say, private archives, but now I'll tell you how private archives look like in terms of female playwrights, even if they were famous in the, early 20th century. So her works, until I got to them, were held by her granddaughter in her own home, in a, very small room. She just had a few boxes with all those plays that no one ever read. And some letters, mostly to like theater journals or theater institutions, proposing them to either print the text or stage the text, and there were only refusal letters. And in fact, most of these plays were never ever printed or staged. So even with this single name, so when you put this name into any historical record, like regular historical record before our project, you would find out that she wrote 2 dramas, maybe 3 if you dig really deep. And then when you go to the private archives, it turns out that she wrote more than 40, and no one heard about that. No one wanted to stage it. What we could do was to digitalize this research. So now, even if something happens with the archives, this work is still there, and actually someone can come and write a book about this amazing woman. She was an actress, she was a director, she was a playwright, and she should be present. I think she should be present in the way we think about theater history. She's also part of feminist history because she was also a feminist in the interwar years. So I think that such discoveries, that there might be more of such discoveries, So whenever you check the name and, but she probably wrote 1 or 2 plays. And if you dig and dig and dig, it turns out, no, 10, 20, 30. So I think like really big surprise was that there were so many dramatic texts written by women. It came as a surprise because even though we expected to find some dramatic texts, we did not expect the number. We were somehow attached to this idea that women prefer novels, this Victorian point of view that women do not write dramas because they are not capable of writing dramas, because they have different brain, and this brain sort of impedes them from writing dramas, yes, but they are good at writing novels. So we thought that perhaps this belief discouraged women from writing dramas, if it was repeated time and time again, that they may have tried rather in novel, even by reasonable judging their chances for success. If you know that dramatic texts written by women are not accepted by theater managers and directors, Then you turn to novels if you want to write, yeah. But it turns out that even that horrible stereotype did not prevent women from writing dramas. So, for instance, the playwright that I talked about earlier, with her, which archives I worked with, when in the interwar years, she was praised by critics. They wrote that the play has a male touch to it, you know, a masculine touch to it. So that was a praise, yeah. Well, look, she's a woman, but she wrote a play like a guy. Yeah, that's great. So the first thing is the numbers. The other thing is that so much has been happening in children's theater and puppet theater and in peripheral theater, so to say. And all these areas of theater history are connected to women. And particularly what we think and hope someone will research more thoroughly, because we can only mark or signal some, you know, some areas, some topics. What a Polish theater artist did in the shortly after World War II. These the late 40s, early 50s, these are the only years where the statistics for women's presence in theater are much higher than later. It actually means that women after the war, it were women mostly who enabled theater to be reborn after the war, particularly in smaller towns. So the woman I talked earlier, Maria Marcewicz-Szopkowska, is a good example, because what she did after war, shortly after war, she establishes a team, a troupe actually, of fellow female artists, and they travel however they can, using very different means of transport. She writes a play for only women cast, solely women cast. And with this play, they drive around, ride around Poland, Polish lands, and show it to people in small towns. And this is very typical for what's happening in Poland shortly after the Second World War. And these are women doing it, not men. So I think that the best thing about Hypatia is that we can do these discoveries, and we can point it to other people, other researchers, and get them interested and get them involved, so that we do not have a new monograph on Grotowski, but we have a new book, historical book, that actually touches upon subjects that were never ever discussed about, and that can totally change our vision of the history of theater. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, you did. And just please translate something into English, because there are people who want, like me, for example, to make comparisons between what happened in Romanian theater, because there are very many similarities, and what happened in Polish theater, which is always an example for us and an inspiration. And if this is happening, has happened in Polish theater, the parallel must be, enforced and underlined, because it seems it's like an Eastern European, or I don't know, Central European kind of reality, not just some particular case with Romania or Poland.
Yes, I think it's very much linked to political history of the region.
And the raising of the nation states, and the way that they were shaped by men mostly. And yeah, but it's really, really interesting to uncover this other reality, because it's really clear for me from what I've discovered in Romanian theater that there was this reality, and it was a powerful one, and it has an impact on society, but in a very different way, I think.
Yeah, I think that what is interesting for me is that we do not only discover things that we did not know about at all, things that were marginalized from the very beginning. You know, there are instances of theatrical work that was not recognized at the time it was being done, and that was the more not recognized afterwards in historical discourse. But there are also examples of successful stories which were utterly forgotten.
How can you explain that? How is that possible?
This is how we try to apply those, rules that we with Kasia came up, showing how even successful female stories could have been forgotten. And usually it's more than one reason. Of course, being a woman is very strong, gives you a very strong chances to be forgotten, but very often there are some, additional points in your biography, in the way you are working, in the way you are writing, and the way you are staging, what place you choose to stage, etc. And sometimes there's only an after, you might call it an after image. So we know about the female artist, but we don't have any sources. We just know that she was like famous. But nothing is left, which is like really so amazingly crazy. So Lydia Zamkov is one of the female directors that I mentioned in my presentation. She's a very good example. You could see in the pictures that she has a very strong image and very strong personality, like devilish personality, you might say, like a femme fatale or whatever. She was also an actress, especially in the beginning of her career. And because she, I'm sorry. That was my mobile. Sorry for that. I can't really turn it down on my computer because then you would not hear me. Hopefully this won't repeat. So she directed with success, but we have no records. And about the successes she had, about this plays she directed, there are only some mentions in the press, which is not enough to reconstruct her personality and her artistic work. So, for instance, Weronika Szczawińska, whom I also mentioned in my presentation, she wanted to do a play about Lydia Zamkov. That was because she thought that Lydia Zamkov can be our cultural mother, like our meaning female directors in Poland, a woman with such a personality, success, good position in theater, etc. So she spent many days in the archives looking for information, for recordings of her stagings, and she came up with nothing. Only a bunch of gossips, some powerful images, but not enough to actually construct this, let's call it a source story for female directors of contemporary times. Yeah.
You mentioned, I was going to ask you about what kind of archives did you use in this research, because you mentioned a personal archive, but I imagine there are mostly public archives that you use. And I know that Polish theater has a much better approach to archives than we do. So, but maybe you would tell me that no. What kind of archives and in what state you found them?
So with 20th century, it's kind of okay. With 19th century, it's a total catastrophe. It's a disaster. Like the archives were destroyed so many times that it doesn't matter what you research, the archives will be poor. So that's with regards to 19th century. With 20th century, it's much better. What we did is we just searched for libraries looking for texts written by women, dramatic texts written by women. The powerful thing is that some of those books, like we were the first to read them ever, because they weren't even, cut. So, and I'm talking about books that were like 100 years ago, published 100 years ago. So you can imagine lying them in the libraries for 100 years, but no one wanted to read them, which is kind of a sad story. But now there is a really very intensified process of digitalization of archives in Poland. I'm not sure how it is in Romania at the moment, but in Poland, there are so many things being digitalized. And we also used the visibility of our project to encourage archivists to digitalize women's work. And at the moment, many female dramatic texts are accessible, are digitalized. We encourage it. We sometimes even financed it a little bit, but we also kind of redirected public resources to digitalize women's work. So when now you enter the web page of Polish National Library, you will find there many numerous dramatic texts written by women. With texts written on theater, with theoretical text, it's much more complicated. It's really wandering in the dark where you can find something or not. So these can be newspapers, of course, especially theater papers, journals, also on kind of memories, but we do look a lot at interviews and this kind of work, because as I said, it's just manifesto or a published program of my artistic vision. It's not something that women did, at least in Poland, at least in Polish context. And then, of course, the statistics. Oh, this was such an horror, really. I mean, this work was the historian worst nightmare. I actually remember being pregnant when we were finishing with the statistics, and I was sitting like with a huge belly in the library and just going page after page after page. So in Poland we have like annual, we used to have, now the institutional situation of theater is much more complicated, so the publications that record what's happening in theaters is also much more complicated. But for the biggest part of the second half of the 20th century, we have annuals of theater works where you have just all premieres are listed, all theaters, institutional theaters are listed. There are names of managers and vice managers of theaters. There are awards and festivals. It's all gathered in one annually published book. So what we did, we just read the book, but we focused on female presence in it. And such a reading of these books actually enabled us to create the statistics it was all there. I mean, the knowledge was there. We did not invent that. We did not have to do anything, specific, unusual. We just take those books and look at them from a feminist perspective. And we keep doing that, actually. And also these books were great for creating this enormous chronicle, which is just just a fragment of women's work. So by going through these annual books, we often underline or emphasize or just note down on the margins some artistic events that we found particularly interesting. And then we checked for press records, whether these events were in any way commented by press records. And if so, if we were able to find any press releases about it and press records, we put it into a chronicle. So when you open the chronicle, you will find, for instance, yes, season, I don't know, 1975, and there will be 10 or 15 examples of what women did in this season with brief excerpts from press. And the chronicle will be continued because that was just tip of an iceberg, and it can be continued until the end of times, I think, because there's really a lot that has been happening, and there are still many names to be recovered, many works to be recovered. But with theater, it's also hard in terms of the sources when there are no registrations and one or two reviews. We can't really do much about it.
Thank you. If there are other questions, Anka, I bet you have some questions because of your similar interests.
Well, I was curious about the women directors. What were your findings? What were your surprises? Because you said that you thought there weren't that many, but then you discovered that there were many directors unheard of or something.
Yes, of course, we discovered that there were quite a few, but very often they worked in not in central theaters, or not in dramatic theater altogether. And this is why in the second edition of Hypatia, we want to devote entirely one of the volumes to children drama, or to dramas written for children. Because children theater was sort of almost entirely created by women, meaning that the texts were written by women. Most of the time, they were also directed by women. Especially, we discovered that there were women involved in puppet theater and children theater together. So there's a number of names, number of women who were both managing puppet theater and directing children plays at this theater. The other thing is also women not only directing, but we also paid attention to female set designers, choreographers. And here, what's also very typical is that women very often play second fiddles. Yeah, so they are not the main choreographer, or they are not called the director, but you look at, for instance, at musical theater, because we also looked at musical theater, and the director is male, but the choreographer, set designer, they are female. And then you start to think, like, who really created this play? I mean, who really staged this performance? yes, I mean, we it was a very humbling process, because we, being interested in theater, knowing a little about theater, some of us more, some of us less, because we are not all theater historians, we meaning people working on Hypatia, and particularly back then during the first edition, a lot of us, we were very young. As I said, we're PhD candidates. So at least half of the team, half of those 12 people were PhD candidates, because I remember that throughout Hypatia, we were like getting married, having children, and all this stuff was happening, doing PhDs, of course. And we, but with us, we worked with more established scholars, and they had the same impression that we were not able to say more than, let's say, 5 or maximum 10 names of female directors. And 10 was like, whoa, you really know a lot. But most of us would be stuck after 5, I think, maximum. And this research shows that there were really much more than 5 female directors in Polish theater history. Not to mention women working for decades in other fields of theater production, which I think is also very much important and very much neglected, like set design, like choreography. Yeah. So again, numbers, numbers, and our own lack of knowledge about them. Even so the terrifying thing is that even people interested in it don't know much, you know. So what about people who are just not interested? I mean, these names were virtually lost in history.
Yeah, it's so interesting that we are passed on. Actually, we receive this information from the previous generation, and if we don't receive enough information, it's just this is the things, like, we have them, but we have, what we can do is to investigate more and to discover people who are forgotten and the reasons for which they were forgotten. We actually started the same here. After 3 editions of the Multimedia Dictionary of Romanian Theatre, we are trying for the next one to focus almost exclusively on women, because we discovered the same paradox. Even if they were the same amount of people studying directing in the Romanian schools, where both women and men, almost similar numbers, what we discover after they graduate is that men are working more, men are reviewed more, everybody is talking about men and their work, good or not, and so much less things are told or written about women. So we are trying to discover why, and it helps very much, and it's inspiring what you did, because yes, statistics, it's very important, because it's a man in a man's world. This is the instrument that everybody's going to pay attention to. And I noticed that you also used in your team a sociologist, if I'm not wrong, or someone from another field than theater.
I think we are mostly, most of us work in theater, but we did have people who helped us to interpret the statistics.
Interpret the statistics, yeah.
Yes, we had people, just give me a second. I'm sorry. Sorry, I will just grab the book.
Sure. We can see it. If you can show
Sorry.
it to us.
So this is this book about statistics. It's kind of
Wow.
big one. So we found people who, turned the statistics into such visual graphics to make it more convincing.
So you gave them the numbers and they, okay.
Yeah, and yes, and I think it worked a lot. You know, from what it worked a lot, meaning it had a huge influence on theater environment in Poland, because well, people talk to us a lot about these books, and many public voices concerned this particular volume with statistics, saying that it was really revelatory for them. Like when they saw the numbers, when they saw those graphics, things that they might anticipate, things that people talk about, that, you know, maybe it is the way it is, suddenly like became like really visible. And it also resonated very strongly with female theater practitioners, like working now in Polish theater. So I also remember meetings with practitioners coming to our meetings, like public meetings when the books were published, and telling their stories. And these stories were just the same as those stories from the past, which was kind of like really depressing. You know, for instance, sometimes, okay, you can imagine that women were working in puppet theater or in children theater because they wanted to do that, because they were interested in these forms of theater. But I also heard stories about young female students graduating from theater academia as directors and looking for a job, and the only thing they could find was puppet theater or children theater. Like no one wanted them to direct a play in a dramatic theater. Yeah, so they want, this is a life situation. Yeah. You need to work, you need money to support yourself. So do you do nothing because you want to do dramatic theater, so you won't accept offers from other types of theater, or do you accept the offer and think that, okay, now I will do a play for children or a puppet play? A puppet play is much better right now, but let's say children play. And when I have a chance, I will move to like regular dramatic theater. And very often you just got stuck in this particular genre, because then you look for a job again, and that's what they told us. And we're like, okay, but you only did children plays, like we don't think you're like suitable for directly a dramatic play for adult audience. This is very interesting in terms of what's happening with children theater, for example, right now in Poland, is that when you are an established director, you're very welcome to direct once in a few years a play for children that is later discussed by theater critics, how you managed to combine this vision for adults with children's sensitivity, etc., etc. So whenever a sort of dramatic, regular male, particularly male director does a play for children, it's a big event. But all other plays for children, and there are many of them, are just not discussed at all. And I must say, saying from a point of view of a mother who's watching a lot of children plays, that this is a very interesting branch of theater in terms of experimenting with space and time and means of expression. And I must say that even before I had my own children, I remember once following an entire festival for children, dramatic festival for children, and I saw back then, like in a row, I suppose 10 plays for children, and I was fascinated by them. And I actually thought after that children theater is in a much better shape than dramatic theater in Poland. In terms of avant-garde and experiments and many things that in children's theater are considered like regular means of expression. When you see them in dramatic theater, critics are astonished by it and discuss it as something extraordinary and really original, which I think is another way of showing how the status rule works, you know, between different genres of theater. So sometimes I think it's not that women always want to do the less prestigious forms of theater. I think that they are structurally directed towards that way, even in ways of looking for job, for new artistic projects. That's at least what many theater practitioners told us when we were discussing these books in public.
A very similar landscape here. And really, there are similarities in terms of public policy related to drama theater texts written by women, and most of them were admitted in children's theaters, and also about set designers, women set designers, which is at least paradoxical, because puppet theater without an extraordinary set designer, it's bad puppet theater. The first thing you meet there, it's a talented set designer, and then comes the directing, and of course specialized actors. But things looks very much alike, and I agree with you totally about the complexity of theater for children, and especially puppet theater, which is, I think, one of the most complex forms of theater ever. But yes, first of all, the theatrical environment was looking to theater for children with some kind of contempt. And theater critics treated theater for children with some kind of contempt, of second-hand theater, you know, which is completely unjust, and from my point of view, it's false. It's not true. But yes, I was thinking, hearing your story, your explanation about the fact that even in Romania, the phenomena, it's absolutely the same. When an important established director, being men or women, is invited or has this crazy idea to put something, to stage something in a theater for children, it's an event. The simple fact he took 1 month, 2 months from his life and dedicated it to theater for children, it's an event in itself.
Yes.
But the other way around, it's not possible. There are so very, very, very few examples of personal artistic trajectory, destiny, who reverse the story, makes from a director, being a man or a woman, but especially women, who began to work in children's theater to to cross the line and enter in and have a career, an important career in drama theater established. We have an example. We had a colleague of us, Mona Kirila, who had such a map of but it's nearly a unique case from what I know. It's very interesting. The things are similar. There are also differences, but it's really, really interesting. It's fascinating. And for me, first of all, it's fascinating the fact that you can work for such a long time in such a complex and with different levels of architecture, I would dare to say, in research. It's an extraordinary.
There are many people involved in this project since its very beginning. Many of us from the first edition are now also present in the second edition, sometimes with slightly revised role. For instance, I moved more towards like theoretical positions because that's my interest right now. I sort of said in the beginning, like, I'm not gonna spend so much time in archives again. Like, not now. Let me think through the findings that we have. But when we were talking about this status rule, it also came to my mind one thing that I forgot to mention, and I think it's also very symptomatic. It's that we while doing the statistics, we found out that quite often women were vice managers in theaters, responsible for economic side of theater, for financial things. So we also thought it's an interesting pattern that the main manager of theater is male and is responsible for artistic vision, but what is doing so-called, dirty job, administrative job, financial things, budget, etc. These are women. This is very often a position held by a woman. So it also reflects this, let's call it invisible work. Yes, this unappreciated work that does not go down in history. Like, no one remembers that and no one cherishes that. But without that work, nothing would have happened. The theater could not have operated at all. So I think in many ways it also resembles the pattern that we know from other fields of cultural production, where quite often women had great input into final artistic result, but no one knows about it because they were either correcting something, writing something, cooking, cleaning, and making it possible for the artist to produce anything at all. But again, it's something that we don't write history books about. So actually, my personal dream is that, oh no, it would be like a confession, but my personal dream is to reach a moment when we will not have to write women's histories like separately from history, like because right now I think it's necessary. The scale of exclusion, the degree of erasure of women's presence in artistic practice, not only in theater but also in other forms of artistic practice, was so great and so systematic that we can't just get over it and not recover it. But the dream is that with the women's artistic practice is not gendered in terms it's not assigned as women's history, which always means that it's something other, you know, that there is a norm and then there is what women did. So my dream is that women's artistic practice is not defined as non-normative, so that we redefine the concept of norm. But at this stage, I think it's not possible, and I don't think it's only Polish case. I think it's more universal problem. Perhaps particularly in our part of Europe, but I'm not so sure that Western Europe is really over it also.
No, of course not. And if you talk to American artists, you would find out that it's the same there. We are obviously in a phase of reparation, and we need to do much more work in order to balance things. But yeah, I totally agree with you that it should be organically included. The women's experiences in theater, it should be organically included in the history,
in the big picture.
The big picture, yes. Women should be there in the big picture. And please keep us updated with what you're doing, and we are going to do the same. And I hope this conversation continues and we can at some point share our results and maybe organize a common meeting, conference, or symposium, or whatever it will be called.
Yeah, we can
share more.
We can plan something like that, some kind of I think some kind of at least a small network of exchanges in this kind of research, at least in this part of ex-communist countries. It's something really useful.
We can involve our colleagues.
It's not very complicated to be done.
No, from the Hungarian department of theater.
Yes, sure.
We have in the same university a Hungarian department, and we can involve them too.
They even had a conference last year on this topic.
On the subject of erasure of women. So
yeah.
Thank you again, Agata, for being with us tonight. It was a great conversation, and it's empowering for us to know that very similar researches are so successful somewhere else. So
it gives us hope.
Exactly.
We're not alone.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's really always a great pleasure to talk about Hypatia. And I would really very much like to know more about your research, and I'm very much in favor of, you know, organizing a meeting, etc. Also, my institute would be always happy to host any feminist meeting. I'm that lucky. So and even only women is also okay. It doesn't need to be feminist even. Yeah. So so I think it's all up to us to organize. Yeah, that would be, I think, great. It would also enable us to look for some perhaps migrant stories, you know, and travel stories, and cultural transfer between women artists in our region, which I'm pretty sure was happening, but we just don't know too much about it.
Yes,
that's true.
Yes. We should
Thank
really
you
do
very
that.
much.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Charming.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good night.
You too, bye.